Learning occurs in many ways: reading, writing, observing, and doing. Montgomery College's access to history is for the doers. Our guests have participated in actions or events that we now recognize as part of history. In the studio, they sit down, mic up, and have conversations with faculty and students from Montgomery College. There is no host, no flashy set, and no commercials, just people and their stories. Sometimes the stories date back many years, and sometimes the story is current. It's all historical, and it's part of Montgomery College's access to history.
I'm Larry Earles. I flew helicopters during the war in Vietnam. They were called hunter-killer missions, and I flew out in front of gunships that had my back once we found trouble. Every day we were designated targets for the enemy. That was the job. It was very dangerous, and that's what I wanted. This is my story.
Mr. Earles, you enlisted in the Army before you were drafted, and you decided you wanted to do back-to-back tours. Tell me about that.
I'll start kind of early on. I was a very troubled adolescent in high school, had a lot of difficulty, was in trouble all the time. I went to an Army recruiter. My desire was actually, I was very enthralled with Vietnam and had seen the Green Beret movie. I wanted to be a sniper, long-range patrol, wanted to be in the thick of whatever action there was. The recruiter advised me that they really were in need of helicopter pilots, and I informed him I'd never ridden in an airplane of any kind, and he said, we'll train you and get you to that point. If you qualify, fine. If not, we'll go back to your plan. I ended up going to flight school, went through basic training, ended up in flight school. Met a young man in flight school named Ernesto Navarrete from El Paso, Texas. We finished preliminary flight school. On the way to advanced flight training, we had 2 weeks of leave, and I went to El Paso with him with the intention of enjoying what as Mexico had to offer, which we did. But at that time, we went around and met much of his family, and Nora Navarrete was his cousin. I met her then. Was enthralled immediately. She wasn't, but I was. It took a little while. Over the period of 2.5 years, which included my 2 tours in Vietnam, I was actually in El Paso 19 days, so we didn't really have a developing relationship other than through letters. We wrote letters to each other every day. I proposed to her in a letter from Vietnam. She accepted in a letter from Vietnam. We planned the wedding in letters from Vietnam. 2 weeks after I was home, we were married and had another 18 months in the military, and then the rest is history.
Can you tell us a little more about the training that you did in the flight school?
Right. Again, I want to regress to my high school days of being a very troubled individual. I didn't do well in school, was not interested, bored, didn't apply myself. I did manage to graduate, but to coin a quote that I've heard in the past, I spent a lot more time in high school than the average guy, so they thought I was special. But going into the military, I found myself in a circumstance in flight school engaged in something that I totally believed in, was totally committed to, very, very interested in, and wanted to be the best that there could be. It was ingrained in my own heart, even without the military doing what they did so well, is trying to make you become a team member. I can't honestly convey what the results of my flight school was, but from my own mind and having succeeded, I think I did very well. I certainly did well enough to pass. It may have had something to do with the fact that Vietnam really needed helicopter pilots, but nonetheless, I did succeed and got there. Preliminary flight school was about 4.5 months long. The first 6 to 8 weeks was ground school. So we went through meteorology and textbook classroom type stuff. I don't know what got my attention that was really important because it was not what I was there for. I wanted to get in the helicopter and learn to fly. But I did, for some strange reason, realized you need to know this stuff. And I excelled in those classes, did well. And then when we got into the helicopters, in preliminary flight school, the objective was 10 hours of actual flight time you would be able to solo, meaning the instructor pilot would step out of the aircraft and allow you to lift the aircraft off the ground, make the radio calls to the tower, take off, do a traffic pattern, and land all by yourself. And I cannot tell you what kind of panic that puts into your system when the instructor pilot gets out of the aircraft. As good as you may think you are, that's your first time of being absolutely, totally on your own. But the vast majority succeeded. And then from that point, you're back with the instructor and learning a great deal of detail and actually learning what you can do with the aircraft and what it will do for you. Going to advanced flight school, we moved from the training aircraft, the very small, basically 2-passenger aircraft, into the Hueys, which were 9 to 13 passenger aircraft with a pilot and a co-pilot and a full crew on board. Much heavier aircraft, same principles as far as how the controls worked and what made the aircraft do what it does. But it would be kind of like going from a small sports car to a dump truck, but still making it do the same job for you. Ended up, the last part of advanced flight training was the armory school, going through gunnery training and so forth, which was exciting. All the noise of firing the guns and hitting your targets and those kind of things. But the one distinct, probably getting a little ahead of myself here, but the one distinct memory I have was when I arrived in Vietnam and was in the Hueys for the first couple of months. Actually engaging the enemy and firing weapons was the first experience I'd had with somebody shooting back at you. And that gives you a totally different concept and feeling.
Tell me about the confidence of a pilot.
My experience, pilots, and I've had conversation with pilots from different military organizations, but mine was in the Army. They seem very similar. Pilots seem to be of a similar bloodline. They're unique in the sense that they're exceedingly confident, exceedingly prideful, arrogant, exceedingly positive. There's nothing they can't do, nothing they won't do. They're going to win. It's almost a distorted viewpoint from the average Joe, if you will. And I'm not sure that's all good in life in general, but in combat, I would rather have someone with me with that kind of an attitude that can make a decision and make it immediately and react on the decision than wonder and question and debate and negotiate about what to do and why to do it and how it's going to affect everybody. Two things that come to mind is I was also an instructor pilot for the OH-6, the Loach light observation helicopter, in our unit. And the part of the training and the instruction I would give to the pilots was hesitation will kill more people than anything else you'll ever do. Make a decision, even if it's wrong, make a decision, take action, and do something. You can always go back and correct, for the most part, anything you do, but not making a decision is very, very harmful. The other thing that comes to mind is an interaction I had with my wife very shortly after we were married. She observed this character which she had not seen before. Now, think, if you will, put yourself in her position, which I'm not sure I can even do, but she's a high school kid. When she meets me, I'm a different person at that point. I go to Vietnam. I have the combat experience exposure to all of the atrocities and everything. I come home, I'm not the same person I was that she knew by any stretch of the imagination. We're married, we're doing well as far as I know, but she's bold enough, and she confronts me at one point, says, you are so conceited. And my reply, which got my attention, as soon as I said it got my attention that I need to think through this and reevaluate my own line of thinking. But she said, you are so conceited. And my reply was, oh no, I'm not conceited, I'm convinced. So that's kind of the attitude and the mindset of most of the pilots that I knew and flew with. Don't know that that's good, but that's what it was.
Can I ask what it was like for you to fly? You know, being pushed right into a helicopter. Can I ask what your experience was like that? You know, ignoring everything that was happening on the ground. What was it like just flying?
Wow. I can't say that I've done anything in my life that was more exciting, more fulfilling. And I've ridden motorcycles and driven sports cars and so forth, but the thrill of being on the controls and the initial impact or effect on me was the thrill of, I can do this, was very fulfilling. But progressing even further into it from there, I actually reached a point, I would describe it as saying, when I went to the flight line and got in the helicopter and strapped in with the harness, I was just putting a jacket on. It became part of me. And it would do anything I ask it to do. And it's I don't know how to describe that. It's a remarkable feeling.
When you were getting close to the enemy, how close would you say you were?
Well, in the Hueys at that point, probably, it's hard to relate the distances specifically, but I'd say maybe as much as a half mile. Because the Hueys were so slow and cumbersome, they didn't always get as close as what I went into later, the Loach, the light observation helicopter, would be like a Corvette. It was very maneuverable, very fast. In the Loach, once I started on the hunter-killer missions that we had, I could be as much as 50 to 60 feet away, eyeball-to-eyeball contact with the enemy, and it's almost like a OK Corral shootout between the enemy and myself.
Can you talk about those hunter-killer missions?
Sure. The hunter-killer was 2 aircraft. It was the Loach that I was in was the hunter. I was in Northern I Corps in Vietnam. It's very mountainous, a lot of trees and shrubbery once you get off the coastline out of the rice paddies, which was where most of the enemy contact took place, was in the mountains. But I would hover and get down into the trees looking for trails, looking for caves, looking for bunkers, looking for any sign at all of enemy activity, and trying the best we could. We were actually a flying target. We were trying to get the enemy to expose their position. And generally that resulted in them opening fire on our aircraft. The killer portion of that team was the gunship, usually a Cobra that was up at a much higher altitude, flying in a position at all times where they could turn and provide us protection as soon as possible. Our mission, as soon as we drew enemy fire or saw made enemy contact, my door gunner, crew chief, one person in the back of the aircraft, would throw a smoke grenade. We always flew where he had the pin pulled with a smoke grenade ready to throw at any moment. He'd throw the smoke grenade, and we would make evasive action to try to leave the area so that the Cobra could roll in and release the armament for them. We would immediately then call our home base. They have what they called a blues team, and it was Hueys with infantry that would respond immediately and come out and go on the ground and actually try to find and engage the enemy that way.
And you were shot down a couple times, right?
7 times, yes, sir.
7 times. How long would it be in between from when you would crash down and be rescued, would you say?
Well, each one varied, but predominantly because we had an aircraft flying support of us and they knew immediately what the situation was, it was much faster than I think one might consider. I would say basically 30 to 45 minutes. But I would say when you're on the ground and you have the enemy all around you and you're waiting to be rescued, it seems like a lifetime. The longest incident I had was probably in excess of 3 hours. And that was definitely a lifetime.
When you were being shot down, do you remember like what kind of altitude you were typically at?
Yeah, very vividly. Although each circumstances could be different in that you're on a specific mission at each time. But as a hunter-killer, my mission was just to be as low as I could possibly be and flying as slow as I could possibly fly in order to try to trick the enemy into engaging. So being at treetop level most of the time in the mountainous areas, I would say less than 100 feet off the ground in every circumstance, sometimes 50 feet off the ground. When you receive fire, you immediately attempt to maneuver your aircraft where you gain altitude and gain speed and take evasive maneuvers to get away from the enemy. But we're also trained, it's almost an automatic, if not an actual automatic response with anything that's unusual with the aircraft, and taking fire would fall in that category. The pilot scans the instrumentation to determine what kind of flight capability remains, and the instruments will give you that immediately. So most of the time it's hard to qualify, but I had some flight capability remaining, so I could at least maneuver maybe as much as a half mile away from where we actually took fire until the crash, if you will, took place. I think there were, out of the 7 times I was shot down, I think 2 of them were instantaneous. There was no reaction time. One instance, there was a great deal of reaction time, and I actually was airborne 15 minutes probably before we lost control and crashed to the ground, if you will. But to specifically answer your question, I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent, but about 100 feet probably, or less.
In the movies, they're a great fireball, but what is it actually like?
Well, again, that would be circumstantial. You have a fairly sizable fuel tank on different types of aircraft. The Loach that I was flying had a 400-pound JP4 tank, so it's a lot of fuel if you happen to be full. If your aircraft takes fire in the fuel tank with the right armament, it could set fire to the aircraft. Fuel obviously is an accelerant, and even if it's not the fuel tank itself that catches fire, the fuel being added to anything else that would ignite, it could become a problem. Out of the 7 incidents that I had, only 1 involved fire, even after it crashed. It was just, and it's all circumstantial. I don't know why the others didn't, but this one particular instance where I was actually airborne for nearly 15 minutes, the other aircraft that was following me we had radio communication, and he kept telling me that there was white smoke. Well, white smoke is good in that it's only the fuel that's burning. It's not the appliances on the aircraft itself. Nothing mechanical has, at least the smoke indicates that. At some point, he was telling me, we see flames and we see black smoke. Black smoke is just like a tire catching fire. It starts to tell you there's something else that's burning. We were able to clear the last mountain range going back into the flatland, what we call the flatland or the rice paddies. We knew we had, and I could tell by my instruments, I was losing flight capability very rapidly. The crew chief was watching out the side of the aircraft. He was telling me on the intercom as well, we need to get on the ground. So we were able to, I just basically came off the mountainside and planted the aircraft in the rice paddy. And the crew chief and I came out of the right-hand side of the aircraft, came out running from the aircraft, and it exploded. Very much like a movie type scenario. And we were hurled to the ground, but we weren't burned, we weren't injured in any way. A most exciting experience, one I wouldn't encourage anybody to have to do.
Allies and enemies are desperately searching for you. How close was the enemy when you were crashed?
The closest was, they got within probably 5 feet of us. There were 4 of us there. It was one of the incidents where I had actually crashed with 2 pilots that I had rescued, so they were shot down in 30 minutes twice. They had a much more exciting afternoon than I did. But we were in elephant grass, which was probably anywhere from 15 to 20 feet high and so thick that you can't hardly see through it at all, and very difficult maneuvering through it. We had managed to get away from the aircraft and maneuver into a bomb crater. Just kind of broke out into a bomb crater, and we set up 4 of us, kind of, if you draw a square, put 1 person in each corner, although it's circular, not a corner, and just got quiet. Said, don't make any noise. We don't have any armament to engage the enemy with. I had a .38 pistol. One of the pilots had a .45. We didn't have anything to engage the enemy with to speak of. So we said, just be real quiet and hopefully we'll get rescued and won't get captured. As it turned out, we were there for probably close to 3 hours before the rescuers were able to get into us, primarily because the enemy were so thick, so prevalent, that they couldn't just come down and rescue us the way normally it took place. So it took quite a concerted effort to get us out of that circumstance.
Can you tell me about your crew chief, I think you said it was?
Yes. Yeah. Is one individual, he served as a crew chief, but the crew chief who did all the maintenance on the aircraft. So once we'd returned to the home base from a mission, his job was just beginning, because he would do anything and everything that had to be maintained, including reloading the armament on the aircraft. But he was also the door gunner in this particular case. And door gunners on the Hueys, they have a seat, which we had as well, but I'll try to be a little more descriptive. They had a seat, they were strapped in with a harness. Their .60 caliber machine gun would only go a certain parameter. The door gunner on the Loach had a harness with a belt, so he would put 1 foot inside the aircraft and 1 foot on the skid of the aircraft and actually be standing outside of the aircraft with his M60 on a bungee cord, and he could go nearly 180 degrees with it. The biggest challenge with that, or the biggest risk, highest risk of that, was if I, as a pilot, happened to be banking to the right, which is where he sat, he could actually shoot into the rotor blades and cause damage to our own aircraft. I never had that happen because we talked about it and trained on it a lot, but it has happened to other aircraft I'm aware of.
What are the other missions you did besides the hunter-killers?
Well, the hunter-killer was the primary mission, but when you're flying on a mission, every aircraft is on an emergency frequency. And if things happen, even without I'm thinking of the emergency frequency being with other aircraft. If other aircraft are shot down, or I had a number of issues where I was in the Army. Marine or Navy aircraft were the jet aircraft that were dropping bombs in places our government said we didn't go. They would be shot down and needed to be rescued. I made 3 different rescues of crews in that circumstance. You're called off of the mission you're on because you're the closest in proximity to where they are, and you respond. You're not the only aircraft that responds, but in those 3 cases, I happened to be the first to get there and was able to get to the crew, get them off the ground, and bring them back to safety. There's other medevac missions with the unit you're working with. Medevac aircraft were limited in number. Sometimes the zone that we were flying in, the LZ landing zone, was so hot, meaning taking so much fire that the medevacs couldn't actually go into them. Again, we're already there working with them. If the unit we're in support of has injured or KIA, killed in action, we would try to take care of that for them. Otherwise, they had to carry the bodies with them.
You have in your possession a North Vietnamese flag. Do you mind telling us the story behind that?
I do. That was a unique mission in itself, but very common in the sense that first thing in the morning, I would go to the operations office, would be given a mission. The mission would tell you, on a map what zone you would be flying in and what unit you're in support of. And generally it was all day long, that entire day. We would go airborne, we'd get a radio contact with the unit. Sometimes we would even pick up their company commander or the unit commander and give them an aerial observatory flight of the zone they're working in. Then you're in contact with them all day long, so it becomes very personal with that particular unit. They had felt that there was a lot of NVA, North Vietnamese Army, activity in that area, but they hadn't been able to find it. My crew chief and I were flying in their zone, not very far from their physical location, and we found a trail. We followed the trail, which led to a cave. We could see the opening of the cave, but not much else. So by radio communication, we led the infantry, which is first of the 501st Infantry in 101st Airborne Division, led them to the cave. They managed to get into the cave and found, I don't know the total quantity of armament, but rocket-propelled grenade launchers, AK-47s, a lot of weaponry that would be used against us. And with that weaponry was an NVA flag. They embroidered they said 2 Thunder 007, which was my call sign, from Jockstrap and the Foul First, which was their call sign. They embroidered that on the flag and presented it to us and gave us credit for actually finding it, even though we weren't on the ground and couldn't go in and get the stuff. But it was exciting to actually have found something like that that would help prevent the enemy engaging with our troops as well.
You served 2 tours back to back. Do you mind giving us that time frame about when did you start?
Sure.
And why?
Graduated from flight school in November 1968, went straight to Vietnam. So I was in Vietnam for Christmas of 1968. I don't know the exact time frame, but in my mind, I know if I went back and read our letters, I could figure it out. Approximately 3 months on my first tour in Vietnam, I had figured out the scheme of how the Army was working. They needed helicopter pilots very, very badly. A helicopter pilot would do 1 tour in Vietnam. They'd go home for 6 to 9 months, and many would come back for a second tour. I had my girlfriend, who was going to be my wife, I thought at that time, and I wanted to get combat behind me so that when we got married, I had a personal conviction that I didn't want to be in combat and have a family. So that kind of tells you I probably wasn't going to make a career of the military, but I was still evaluating all options. I wrote to Nora and suggested to her that if I volunteered and stayed for a second tour, that once I came home from the second tour, it would be behind us and we wouldn't have to face being married, possibly having a family, and then going back to Vietnam. So I think probably with some reluctance, but she understood and she agreed. So I went very early on. Before I was 6 months in Vietnam, I volunteered for the second tour and stayed for the tours. And As it turned out, most of my difficulty was in the second tour. I think it was shot down all 7 times in the second tour. But I ended up coming home in July of 1970. So it was just short of 2 years that I was there.
Do you mind telling us the name of your helicopters?
Sure. I actually painted, I have some pictures of it. I painted on the side of them Nora 1, Nora 2, Nora 3, Nora 4, Nora 5. The last one was 8. When I left Vietnam, 8 was still flying.
And of course, as soon as you got home, you married her how many weeks later?
It was 2 weeks after we got home, after I got home.
Can you tell us what it was like once you got back home?
Oh, it got better and better. Initially, I flew into Seattle, Tacoma, Washington. Was so excited to get home, and trying to put it in perspective, the technology and the communication capabilities of the day were so much different than they are today. I was in Camp Evans of 101st Airborne Northern I Corps. We were a closed base. We had no Vietnamese on the base. We never had the entertainers come to the base. We didn't have the news media. I don't remember listening to any radio programs. We didn't have a television. I didn't know what was happening in the country back at home. Flying home was so excited and anxious and ready to get home, and I think in the back of my mind, I had even prepared myself for all the congratulatory, welcoming pat on the back, just short of a parade, for what I even arrogantly believed was the sacrifices that I had made to fight for our country and those kind of things. Walking off the plane into the airport at Seattle, Tacoma, Washington, was greeted with hordes of protesters with signs, being spit on, cursed at, called a baby killer. I don't even know what all it was. It was all disgusting and very troubling. It affected me emotionally to a degree, but it wasn't disabling, which I think it was to a number of veterans. I'm not sure why, but it didn't affect me that way. It was very hurtful. I didn't, and still don't understand it. The one thing I can say today is I'm very grateful that our nation is not doing that to the veterans today. They're not in favor of war. They don't want us to be there, but they're not, for lack of a better term, they're not abusing the veterans for doing what they're doing.
Can you talk about mail calls and the Dear John letters?
Sure. Again, that's one of those things that I never gave any thought to until I was actually in Vietnam and walking through daily life and activities with my comrades. Mail call became the single most important highlight of the day. And you could see among each other when the mailman, whoever's delivering the mail, comes with a stack of mail and is delivering it, you could see the excitement of those that got mail and the sheer disappointment and dejection, rejection of those that didn't get mail on any given day. It was very, very important to have that communication with your family, friends, whoever might be, wherever the mail came from. It didn't matter where it came from. It was just very, very important to actually get some mail. The challenge with that, however, and it happened quite frequently in our unit, and I suspect throughout Vietnam, and you've heard, everybody that's heard anything about war stories or war situations have heard the stories about the Dear John letters. I had friends in our unit that got letters from their girlfriends or their actual spouse. Said they, for whatever reason, they couldn't put up with it anymore. They couldn't tolerate it. They couldn't wait any longer. And they were divorcing or not being a girlfriend anymore, whatever the case may be. the immediate impact of that on the individual was, well, I have nothing else to live for. I don't want to go home. I have nothing to go home for. So I'll just stay here and do. Some of them volunteered for another tour. Some of them just went almost suicidal until their comrades would get around them and encourage them and build them up and try to get them back into a sense of reality. A very, very devastating effect on people.
And of course, this wasn't your case. You had a lot of mail exchange between you and Nora.
Yes. It just happened that way. We didn't discuss it or plan it, but as I had indicated earlier, I met her halfway through flight school, and I don't know how to describe it other than within seconds after I saw her for the very first time, bells and whistles went off, and I knew that she was the one. It took a while for her to come around, but she did. Very few months after we met, and we hadn't been together maybe on 4 different days and only a few hours of each of those days before I went to Vietnam. But we were already, even in flight school, writing letters back and forth. And it ended up in Vietnam, she wrote me every day and I wrote her every day. There were times, just because of mail delivery or physically where you're located, that I wouldn't get a letter for 2 or 3 days, but then I'd get 4 or 5 letters all at once. And I'd put them in sequential order and read them accordingly and reply to them accordingly, that sort of thing. But like I said, I never gave any thought to that until I'm there. But once you're there, that kind of support, that kind of encouragement is crucial to just your mindset, having the power of positive thinking, if you will. It's priceless. There's no way to say how valuable that is.
Well, with today's technology, how do you think it differs, with how it was back then when you just got the mail and, it would take a while going overseas?
Sure.
Well, today it's kind of instantaneous and they will be able to look at their laptop at any time when they can, of course.
Sure. I'm not so sure today's technology is really good in all senses. Mm-hmm. It's good that in that you can maintain communication, and whether it's real or not, I don't know, but I've seen some of the movies where the soldier is on the laptop Skyping with his wife or girlfriend or whatever, and all of a sudden he's engaged in a firefight and the wife knows it or his girlfriend knows it. I can't imagine that being really positive and helpful. Communicating, yes, but not under all circumstances. Maybe that was just a Hollywood scenario, but that's what comes to my mind when I think of that kind of technology and how detrimental it could possibly be.
Can you tell us the relationship before and after the war with your wife?
Sure. I'll try to make it brief. It's somewhat challenging maybe, but I've shared with you a couple of times about how we met, started writing letters. When I graduated from flight school, I had a couple of days in El Paso with her and her family. We never really had a dating relationship the way you would think of it. I don't know that we ever actually had a date, so to speak. But I think of just the nature of who we were and what we were. When I graduated from flight school, I weighed 198 pounds, and I was just almost a bodybuilder kind of guy, very stout, very physically fit, so forth. Had the typical military haircut. Went to Vietnam, was there for 2 tours. I grew a mustache, which I didn't have when I met her. Couldn't have the full facial hair, but I had the mustache. When I came home and saw her for the first time, I weighed 143 pounds, and she didn't recognize me. So, but she said, even then, I'm committed to you, whoever you are and whatever you are when you come back. So her attitude and my attitude was we were committed to one another. She had many friends ask her during my tour in Vietnam, she shared with me, how do you know that he's even going to come back, or that he won't come back maimed or an amputee or whatever? She says, that's in God's hands, and however he comes back is what it will be. When I did come back, I wasn't maimed, wasn't paraplegic or anything, by the grace of God. We were married. We learned one of the very first things we actually had a conversation about was our communication. It's very important that we don't assume that we know what each other's thinking or doing or want to do or anything. We need to communicate. And so I believe from the very get-go of our relationship, it was a foundational stone, at least, was communication. And we really worked at that very, very much so. And I think we still do. It just doesn't get as much emphasis probably vocally by saying we need to communicate. We know we need to, and we do that still. So, but here we are 46 years later, so something's working.
Since you ended your military career within those 2 tours, so what did you go on to do after that for work?
I didn't prepare at all for coming out of the military and what I would do. So when I came back from Vietnam, I was at Fort Hood, Texas for about 1.5 years. Got out of the Army. We moved to Oklahoma City. Don't know why, just that's where we ended up. I sold vacuum cleaners for about a month and decided I wasn't a salesman. I drove a Borden's milk truck for about 3 months and decided I wasn't a milkman. Moved to Big Spring, Texas, because answering a newspaper article wanting a shop foreman in a fiberglass pipe manufacturing company. We moved down there, got the job, did that for, I want to say about 4 months. In the fiberglass industry, there's a lot of resin and stuff that I was allergic to, and so I was having some physical difficulty with that. Decided it wasn't worth the long-term physical impairment it might cause, so I went to my boss and resigned from that job. Moved to El Paso, Texas, which is where my wife and her family are from. Worked as a sporting goods manager for about 1 year. During that year, I applied with the government wanting to be a Border Patrol officer. Ended up getting a call from the federal prison system, interviewed. Liked what I heard. I took that job. There's a little more to it in that I didn't get hired immediately. I was talking to my wife's father, who's a veteran service officer in El Paso, and he said, "Did you tell him you were a combat veteran?" I said, "No, it never came up." He said, "Call him." I called them and shared that with them. Back in that day, they had what was called a 10-point preference for veterans preference. I got hired the next day and was at work within a week. Going back a little bit during the time, part of the difficulty of finding a job, searching for work, the interviews would go well up to the point that they would ask, were you a military veteran? Were you in Vietnam? My answer, I didn't talk about it up till that point until they asked. Once they asked, I would answer in the affirmative, and they'd say, "Well, we don't have a spot for you now, but we'll keep your information on record." So I found it very challenging in many places. The veterans were not viewed as a positive addition to the workforce. So,
You went on to be a prison guard?
in the federal prison system, I worked 2 years in, it's called FCI Latuna, Federal Correctional Institution. It's a minimum security alien detention center, basically. Worked as a prison guard. About 3 months after starting as a prison guard, the administration found out that I knew how to type That's one of the few courses in high school that I excelled at. They made me the captain's clerk, so I did a lot of administrative duties with that. Within 2 years, as with a lot of organizations, their human resources or personnel department post job opportunities and so forth. There was a safety training position available at Terre Haute, Indiana. I applied for it and was selected, moved to Terre Haute, Indiana, was a safety trainee for a year, promoted to assistant safety manager for a year, and then promoted to safety manager. I worked, I think, 4 different federal facilities, including a penitentiary, as a safety manager, was promoted to regional safety administrator in Philadelphia, the Northeast region, and then 20 months later promoted to the national safety administrator in Washington, D.C., and that's how we ended up here in 1987. And I planned on spending about 18 months in Washington, D.C. and moving back to Texas, and we're still here.
But it isn't that bad here, is it?
It's not that bad. It's not that bad. All our kids and our grandkids are here, so we're where we need to be.
Did you ever fly again?
Not professionally. I've had 2 different opportunities. The very first opportunity I had to fly helicopters again, and the exact model helicopter that I flew in Vietnam was 35 years after coming home. And much to my pleasure, I had always thought that it's like riding a bicycle, you wouldn't have too much trouble, and that was the experience. And the instructor I was with was very sensitive and aware, and he encouraged me. He said, you'll do fine. You won't be as proficient as you were then, but you'll do fine. And it was quite an exciting. I had about 2 hours of flight time in that particular opportunity. Then one other time later, a similar experience. But professionally, decided I have a family, they're the priority. Flying is not healthy for a family opportunity. So.
Is there anything, any experience from your time in Vietnam that still affects you today?
Probably all of it for the most part, but that's a broad spectrum. The most challenging things I shared with you much earlier. I haven't been to the Vietnam Wall in quite a number of years now, and it still affects me when I go there. I did have a number of fellow pilots that were killed in Vietnam. One especially that was a very, very close friend. I think that, even though you realize that's part of combat, that's part of war, honestly, I don't know of any of the pilots over there that could tell you that, yeah, we're going to live and we're going to go home. We didn't know for sure, but losing comrades, seeing that combined with just being right in the midst of the atrocities of warfare, the death. I can specifically recall engaging with enemy. I'd have eyeball-to-eyeball contact with enemy 50 feet away. We're shooting at each other like a shootout at the OK Corral I mentioned earlier. And I consciously had the thought, I don't know these people. I don't hate these people. They don't know me. But we're on different sides, and it's survival. It's a matter of survival and protecting the good guys and the bad guys, for lack of a better way to put it. And my mission is to protect what I believed were the good guys. It's not only a daunting task, but it's haunting in many respects. I don't have nightmares anymore. I don't wake up in cold sweats or anything of that nature, but I did for quite some time.
Have you ever told your family, wife, or kids about your experience?
Yes, I have. I do attempt to be aware of my audience, if you will. I've actually had the privilege of making a presentation to a number of school groups. Some of them are elementary school groups, and they may not even know what Vietnam is, much less what warfare is and those kind of things. So I do try to temper my conversation and the actual stories with information that is appropriate to who I'm speaking to. But most of my family have been and are still of the position they want to know the facts, what really happened, and they're old enough to deal with it. So, yes, I have had that opportunity.
Have any of those kids ever asked you a question you never thought about before, or?
I don't think any questions I've never thought about, but there's one particular instance. I want to say may have been 9 or 10-year-old young man in the elementary classroom I was addressing. After giving most of the information, he raised his hands, and I take questions all throughout the presentation. And I stopped and I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Were you killed in Vietnam?" I said, "No." No.
Did you agree with the U.S. going into war in Vietnam before going in, or?
Well, absolutely, but from a very young man's perspective, from the first I knew of it, started contemplating becoming a soldier, if you will. 18, 19 years old, not well informed, didn't watch the news, didn't know the politics, didn't care about the politics. I believed in the American creed of protecting the innocent and fighting for freedom of the underprivileged people. And most of the volunteers, at least, that I served with were that way as well. So yes, I definitely believed in it at the time.
Do you think there was any similarities between that mindset today with the war on terrorism?
I believe it would be very similar in the mindset. I don't know that I can answer that. I'm much, much older these days. But I believe largely that's a part of why young men and women are on the front in the military, because they are so committed, and not meaning this derogatorily at all, but they're not that well informed as well. Today's military, from what I understand, is predominantly all volunteer. They're committed, they're dedicated, they'll do what they're told. It's an ideal situation for that. The similarities, I think, from Vietnam and the war on terrorism is that you really don't know who your enemy is. Vietnam was guerrilla warfare. We had to search out and get the enemy to expose themselves before we could actually engage. Terrorism is, I think it's even a step beyond that. You could pass your enemy on the street and within the next few minutes be engaged and not even know who they are. So it's much more complex, much more difficult, but from the mindset of the soldier, I think very similar.
If you can meet your 21-year-old self, what would you tell him?
Oh my goodness. Love life, respect your fellow man, make contributions. Don't just take what you think you might have coming. Because as a young man, I was very self-focused, very selfish, very proud, very arrogant. My military experience served to change my life completely. And part of that, a large part of that's Vietnam. But Vietnam just happened to be the circumstances that brought me into a team of people, a family of people, happened to be in the Army, and to care about others and to put others before you, things of that nature, which I had never entertained that thought before. I think it was a rich experience for my life. At least that's the way I view it.
Well, thank you for your time and thank you for your service.
You're welcome, sir. It's my privilege.